now.
Perfect.
Give me 1 second. Yep, we're live.
Well, welcome to the room. I'm super excited to have with me as the SONA co-chair of the Education Committee. I'm super excited to be interviewing you, Miss Alice Randall. Let me see. So I have a thing I'm supposed to say, so let me say that really fast. I'm Andre Alexander, Dr. Andre Alexander. I'm a musician, Grammy Award-winning musician and professor at the University of Southern California. I am a foodie, so I like to eat a lot of food. And of course, I love to advocate for songwriters. And I'm honored today to be speaking with the one and only Miss Alice Randall, who is a prolific songwriter, New York Times bestselling author of multiple books, a music historian that specializes in all music history, but specifically Black country music. And her new book, which is coming out, is incredible. I had the privilege of being able to go through it once, and I have a lot more times to go through it because there's so much. Look at that. Amazing. And she has a new album project that is coming out in a few weeks called My Black Country. And I don't know how much more detail you want me to go into, but I can go into a lot of it if you want me to. The first country song of a Black woman ever to reach #1. Phenomenal. Founded the Midsummer Music Series, or a company that exists and played a role in launching the career of country music star Garth Brooks. Um, First Black woman. Oh, they said that one already. Oh, this year's what is it? Trisha Yearwood's X's and O's was a phenomenal song I loved. Let me see. You've collaborated with Glenn Campbell, Mary Osmold, Holly Dunn, Bandy, and Randy Foster, to name a few of the people you collaborated with. And you're in the humanities department at Vanderbilt, is it is?
African American Diaspora Studies.
Okay, African American Diaspora Studies at Vanderbilt. Uh, Welcome. I'm excited to be talking to you.
Andre, I am more excited to be talking to you. I am
No.
thrilled to be connecting with you today. There's so few of us who are both professors and makers. You know, you're actually creating in the world, and you were also reflecting on other people's creations in the world. And I love talking to people who make and reflect.
I agree. It's very few of us. I'm excited. Well, let's jump right into it. My first question, can you go into detail about how you learned to write this hillbilly music from your perspective as a Detroiter learning from Motown?
Well, I was born in Detroit City in 1959. I was born the same year as Motown Records. And so I think that made a lot of difference in my whole life and trajectory because I was surrounded. My family were not in the music business, but they were friends with the Gordys. My father was particularly close to Anna Gordy, and a lot of people forget. And since it's Women History Month, I want to point this out right now. Before Barry founded Motown Records, Anna and one of her sisters founded Anna Records, and they had a huge hit on Money with Barrett Strong. So I think that I was in a community where Black women were founding publishing companies and record labels and being involved with A&R, as well as singing and songwriting. And so, and I also think of one of the things I always like to call out, I think that songwriting is an elemental art form
Hmm.
that often right after birth, mothers around the world will sing, make melodies up to their children and sing to their children. And also children left alone. I had a bad mama. If you read my book, you know I had an abusive mother. And like many children, I escaped into my own imagination. And so to I wrote my first hillbilly song in a Motown cherry tree. And that took three things happening. One, my father, who was a wonderful man, but an alcoholic, had parked me in front of too many bars. I said when the factories were going 24/7 in Motown, the bars were going 24/7 too. So he would park me in front of a bar and said, I'd dash in there. And by the time the hands on the clock get to here, I'll be back. And he was always back. He always did what he said. He was very reliable. But this one day, I'm about 3 years old. I look up at that sign and I say, Daddy, don't go in that BAR. I didn't know what he was going into. I didn't know what a BAR was, but I knew when he dropped, there would be that sign. And he said, not he wasn't going in. He said, I've parked you in front of too many bars if you're reading that sign out to me. So he took me in with him to get that drink. And that's the first place I learned the power of my own language, because I use my words. I said, Daddy, don't go in that BAR, and I changed something. Fast forward a year or two later, I am sitting up in the branches of this cherry tree right beside the John C. Lodge freeway. And I'm remembering that. And I am making up little songs to the birds and singing. And I started singing, Daddy, don't go in that BAR. Daddy, don't leave me alone in the car. I'm wishing on a something star. Daddy, don't go in that BAR. And to me, songs are like that. You take something that's almost too hard to bear, and you turn it into a song that makes the hard bearable. And for me, that moment of being alone and that my most trustworthy parent was both abandoning me, but also taking me with him, if I use my language, that was almost too hard to bear. And then I turned it into a song. I brought that song with me to Nashville in 1983. When I moved to Nashville, that was one of the lyrics that I carried with me. And I could never, and it got picked out. It was the first one, Archie Jordan, who wrote What a Difference You Made in My Life, and all these big country gospel songs, classics. He picked that one out. And I said, that happened to me. And he said, I know. I said, how do you know? He said, no one could invent that. But I could never write it because I didn't want to change it from what 3-4-year-old me had written. I could never change it. It had to just stick there.
In your book, you talk about this phenomenal concept of the difference between white country and black country, and then you even break down the different lyrical ways that you write, the different topics. Maybe you can go into a little bit of detail about that, because that maybe will inform some of the songwriting techniques that you use.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I say about country, what makes country country, the first thing I have to say is country isn't country unless it has African influences. So to me, country is Celtic, English, Irish, Scottish forms, plus African influences that can come in a lot of different ways, plus evangelical Christianity. So those three things have to be present for a song to be country. But then there's these themes, and this is where we see the racial fault line in country, is life is hard, God is real, the road, family, and liquor make significant compensations, and the past is better than the present. But the difference between Black country and white country, to make a broad, reductive generalization, is in a lot of white country, the past that is better than the present is a mythologized lost Dixie. Or in the MAGA moment, it's some earlier time in the century where people thought things were going right for them. In Black country, the past that is better than the present is a lost Africa before colonization, or in a childhood moment that, even though we know that slavery stole childhood and that Jim Crow segregation stole childhood, we also know that some Black families were able to preserve moments of innocence and joy for their families, despite for their children. And Black people in country songs, Reese Palmer in Somerville, is looking back to that moment when she is running through the sheets in her grandmother's backyard that are hanging on the line. That's her lost innocence. In Al Green, the Bell album, which I love that album so much, he is seeing that lost Africa in the projection in nature that you often see in Black country. In the current song, Texas Hold'em, you see it in the form of Beyonce's song of the tornadoes and the honey are these representations of nature that to me capture a longed for and lost Africa.
Wow, incredible. With that, I don't want to go too far into the creative side just yet. I want to start to talk about the concept of advocacy and how you talk about that often. Sona, of course, as an advocacy organization that is consistently fighting for the rights of songwriters, we want to know what ways have you advocated for yourself as a songwriter, especially being a Black woman in the 1980s in Nashville? Can you please describe how it was when you first came into the Nashville scene and any differences you see now?
Well, one thing is, I moved here in 83, 41 years ago to start up Midsummer Music, that publishing company. So the first thing is, and I took a scouting trip in the fall of 82. And I went to Acuff Rose, this is a very famous publisher. They publish Hank Williams Sr. They publish very important early country songs. And the man at my very first meeting put his feet up in his desk, literally, and said to me, "Where are you from?" And I tried to tell him I was born in Detroit, but I grew up in Washington, D.C. And he said, "Wherever it is you're from, just go back there. You need to just go back." He said, he said, "I don't see it. I don't see it. You need to go back to wherever it is you're from." Then he started to walk this back a little bit. And he said, "It could be, it's been such a long time that I've met any writers I swear he said something like, your low level of development or soft material, this raw, maybe I just can't recognize it at this." He said, "I'm going to share it with some young writers and see what they say, and I'll get back to you." So I got back to Washington, D.C. after this trip to Nashville. And I'm thinking, maybe I'll go, maybe I won't. He writes me a letter and he said, "I shared it with my young writers and they agree with me. You have no talent whatsoever." He put that in writing. So the first thing I did to advocate for myself is to not let other people define me.
Mm.
And I girded myself in defiance. Is that I thought that's when I decided to move to Nashville. I was going to prove him wrong. So number one is you cannot let other people define your art, define your achievement. But the next thing I did do that was I think, important for me is I realized I had to make my own structures. I couldn't count on the existing structures to actually support me at that point. And so part of the way I did that was to found my own publishing company, to get outside funding. And I actually looked for a woman-based funder to invest in my company, someone who really understood my vision. I made sure to get enough, we had a 3-year plan, enough funding for me to be able to come in here. And, I ended up, so I put myself as an artist and management from the very beginning because I could not trust that the system was going to support me artistically. So I ended up signing one writer, eventually Mark Sanders, who's in the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame now. I was part of the group that had Garth Brooks at the very beginning. Midsummer had a small part of that. And so I was working both ends of the street, that I actually started a publishing company, hiring other writers, but also writing myself. I also want to admit and to put this right out there, I didn't always advocate for myself as carefully as I should have. That I was, it's called the music business, but a lot of us were in it. We are really there for the love of the art and our realizations that songs are sacred and help people survive. And so that can be abused and used against us. Because I made the worst business deal of my entire life. Someone told me I didn't need to. I didn't need to read the contract. It didn't say anything. It just extended a term. And I know better than that. I had lawyers. I paid lawyers. I knew not to sign something I hadn't read. I graduated from Harvard University. And because I trusted somebody and thought of them as being like a family member to me when they were really a business associate, I listened and I signed away a large part of my royalties on my biggest song. And so I humbly say I did not always advocate. I started off really advocating for myself well. I did not always do that. And as long as you're in the business and in the industry, you've got to advocate for yourself every day. And one of the things you have to do is create coalitions of other writers and other songwriters, because that was a songwriter wouldn't have done to me what that got done to me, that if they were still on the songwriting side. And so I think that it's important to realize to create that team, and that team that includes the lawyers, that team that includes the accountants, that team that includes the other allies, like the songwriters, Sona, that Sona is really significant because it allows us to work in collective and share wisdom, and would have given me some allies that said, no matter how much you love them, how much you like them, how much you want to show your loyalty, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate, you get what it says on the paper, and never forget that.
It's really interesting. I always talk about the concept of we as creators, songwriters, musicians, our role in society is to take culture during our lifetime and to crystallize it into this musical art form. With that being said, we always think about the proper way to crystallize it. Is it sound this way? Are our words visual enough to portray this feeling, emotion, all of these things that occur? But because of that, we're so stuck in that world that nobody else sees or hears or tastes or touches but us, that we never think about monetizing it, because our goal originally was just to document it. We are the documenters. We are the soundtrack creators for people's lives.
Absolutely. That I love that we are the soundtracks for people's real lives. We are the thing that people on their deathbed often want to hear music. People being born, that when you're watching, when you are sick in the hospital. I had actually oral surgery done. I drink a lot of coffee and don't drink a lot of water. They couldn't get the IV set up for the oral surgery because I was too dehydrated this time. I said, let me get my iPod. This is back to these iPod that I said, I think I can do this major surgery that was supposed to need IV sedation. I said, if I have my earphones on, if you let me play my music, I can do this. And they did remove my wisdom teeth in the Vanderbilt surgery room with my music on. I made a playlist called Teeth for further work that I had to be done. But the point is, music is so powerful. It will help you get through. And that's why it is holy. But you have to realize, to live to play another day and compete, and to be doing able the philanthropic things that we want to do, we creators have to be not afraid to make money, collect money, manage our own money, advocate for ourselves so that we can do the philanthropy we want to do, because we will do it with a different empathy heart than the people who are just making money and never made any music. Because when you're making music and writing songs, you have connected to other people's souls and sorrow and joys. You can't be successful. It's different. Like, I'm also a novelist. You can be a really successful novelist and 40,000 people bought your novel and read it. You can't be a really successful songwriter and 40,000 people. When you're talking about a #1 song, millions of people all around the world have heard your song. To be a hit songwriter, and that's the part I'm humble about, but also bold about. That's one of the reasons I like vowed to you on what you have achieved. This is text for the planet. And I made text TEXTS. More people are going to hear songs right now than are going to read the Bible or the Quran right now. And so these are the things that are out there, uplifting people, but connecting to them. You cannot get a song being listened to and remembered by all these people unless you are connecting to something significant that is almost true, that is some part of a universal human experience, like what Jung would have called the collective unconscious. Without tapping into that, a hit song does not happen.
It's so interesting. Well, I didn't want to stop you. Were you finished?
No, I am. No, yeah.
It's so interesting, that topic, and I don't want to go on a tangent on this, but of course, everyone with their fear of AI taking over musicians' jobs, etc. I believe that, of course, just like every other segment of society, we will be affected. However, the more authentically human that we can be as songwriters, the more we tap into that collective consciousness, the ability to orate the experiences on a micro level, it's going to be really difficult for an AI to do that. So I love the way that you express that.
AI can't do what we do. It might be able to help us in some ways, because technology is real and it's part of our reality, and things will be changed. But what's interesting is, and one of my books was used on the original model that taught language model, because you were able to now look and see what text they used to teach the original models. And one of my books was used in one of the major platforms that put this together. But the thing is, the book, if you take AI and distill, you only know what I knew at that point. Even if you take my ideas, you don't know the ideas I invented tomorrow. You don't know the language I invented today. AI can only randomly create novelty, and random novelty usually makes no sense. But so it can only do, I always tell my students they can't get an A unless they teach me something new. AI can only, it's like Wikipedia, it can only look at what's been known. We are, all of us, inventing new things. That's what we do at our best, is seeing new connections. And I think Garth Brooks said this, I want to hear the song that AI creates that makes someone cry. Like when that happens, I will start getting worried. Or like the songs that really propel people to make love. It's hard to say what was it in those Al Green songs that gets people having their clothes fall off more than tequila. Like there's that weird country, it's like tequila. Well, how many babies? No one knows. AI, no one has figured out. It's something, it's not the perfection. It's the imperfection. It's the complexity. It's that human thing that's changing every day. Does that make sense? And so that's why AI, I asked AI what I should wear for my photo shoot for my new book and album. I said, I'm a Black woman country songwriter, and I told all these different things. And it gave me 4 really interesting ideas, none of which I used. The ideas were based on country songwriters who had had big albums and big books, crossed with its idea about Black people in country, all of these things. And basically, I took those ideas that AI told me, and I said, okay, so these are exactly what I'm not wearing. And what do I not like about what it's reheating the best of what's worked. It's just trying to work the odds and say, oh, these are successful, but they weren't innovative. And then I said, I want to put my grandmother's garden on a Manuel coat. I'm remembering Graham Parsons' marijuana leaves. Now, AI did not come up with that. AI did not think there's any relationship with me and Graham Parsons. He did not understand that. And then I go to Manuel, and then I have my grandmother's garden on a Manuel bolero jacket. And does that make, in his own innovation? Because I was imagining a long coat or the kind, he said, no, he wanted like a little bolero coat with me, and then a long shirt that could be like a dress. He's inventing. It was nothing. It's perfect. And it was nothing AI came up with.
Wow. It's so interesting you would talk about that. Let's talk about, with your ability to document not just the human experience, but you as a historian, why do you think it's important for you to, like you said in the book, one of my favorite lines, you said so many lines that but you were describing how you went from being a writer to now writing the history and focusing on that aspect of writing, but still, of course, being a writer, but from songs to history. What is the importance of that, especially as a Black woman, especially for the Black community? And I want you to talk about the 1600s, because that was one of my favorite parts as well.
Well, if we start way back in the 1600s or 17th century, I say that country music was born, probably it's a moment we don't have a picture of, we don't have a recording of, but when the first Black baby was born in these United States to an enslaved woman, and she takes part of an African melody that she remembers because she was brought across the ocean in chains. And she's hearing on that boat, and she hears in the colonies, the Virginia colonies, some of these Celtic ballads. And she's hearing this new evangelical Christianity that's being pushed onto her. That when she takes that African melody and that little bit of that British melody that she's hearing in this evangelical Christianity and turns it into a sung prayer for her newborn baby. That is the birth of country music, as far as I'm
Mm.
concerned. And it requires that mix up. One of the reasons, I've been at this 41 years, so the first 20 of it, I might have been writing songs, and some of them included history. I wrote the Ballad of Nat Love, which is a really important song to me, never got recorded past the demo stage, but it's about a Black man who started off life as a cowboy, wrote his own autobiography, and then he turned into a Pullman porter. So songs, part of that Celtic ballad experience is that songs themselves can tell historical stories. And that's why, and some history is remembered because it was captured in song. The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, so many, John Henry, who would remember mythical or real John Henry if he wasn't the star of so many songs. But so I think the birth of country music starts off in the 17th century, Virginia. We have some early, there's an old painting that's now at Williamsburg called the Old Plantation. And we see a Black man in a community of Black people playing the banjo, an early banjo in that. So we know there's early Black people in country music. But to get closer time, we're in the 21st century now, the 20th century. People think country music is so white, and they think white people created country music and that Black people might have had some influence on it. But actually, one simple history lesson I want to give you, and why I wanted to spotlight this, is because this has been so erased. Modern country music, in my mind, began December 10th, 1927, on a radio station called WSM. And the announcer said, "You just been listening to Grand Opera. Now we're going to hear some Grand Ole Opry." And the next sound that was heard is D. Ford Bailey playing Pan-American Blues. D. Ford Bailey was a Black man who was playing on WSM radio on this show. I think it was called Barn Dance. But he was a third generation, he called it Black hillbilly singer. His grandfather was an extremely successful professional musician. This is before recorded country. So D. Ford Bailey plays on the Opry in 27. 1930, go 3 years later, we got Lil Hardin Armstrong playing on Blue Yodel No. 9. Many people consider that to be the most iconic country single of all time. 3 people played on that. 2 of them were Black. One was Jimmy Rogers. The other was the great Louis Armstrong. And the third one, the one who's on every bar of the song, is Lil Hardin Armstrong from Memphis. She's driving the session with her piano. She probably brought the song to the session. Blue Yodel No. 9 has its roots in traditional songs that were known in Memphis at the time. Jimmy Rogers had never been to Memphis. The song, if some of its lyrical form talks about, you got a name on the shirt. It talks about, it's a washerwoman's song. Who was washing clothes in Memphis in 1930 and before that? Black women. This song is from the point of view of a Black woman. But they did not put Louis Armstrong's name on the single. They did not put Lil Hardin's name on the single. They called it some band. They erased them from the history, but the sound, and when people want to listen to these 2 new Beyonce singles that have dropped, and they point out, well, 16 Carriages has a trumpet on it. Blue Yodel No. 9 had a trumpet on it in 1930, and that's a Stone hillbilly classic. So there have been trumpets, Black trumpets on country music since 1930 and perhaps before. So Black people, and then I can't leave before I mention Herb Jeffries. Lil Hardin discovers Herb Jeffries in Detroit. She's sitting with Louis back right after this shortly after this session, sends him up to Chicago where he's going to be with Earl Father Hines. But Lil discovers him in Detroit after she's played on that hillbilly session. And what does he do next? He gets out in California after being in Chicago. This is Herb Jeffries. And he starts making Black singing cowboy westerns, films. He stars, helps produce in a whole series, what we call them Bronze Buckaroo movies. And this is going to help people remember Gene Autry and Gene Autry, these other white singing cowboys, Ritter, but they erase the Black singing cowboys. And Herb Jeffries was making movies in the 30s and 40s. Oscar Micheaux made a Black Western. So, and then on the other side, we get from D4 Bailey, we'll get to Charlie Pride, who will be the first Black man to have a #1 on the actual charts. But I always say Lil Hardin and D4 Bailey, their genius child, is the extraordinary Ray Charles. So in 1962, which is almost half a century ago now, Ray Charles will drop Modern Sounds and Country and Western Music 62, 63. And this is an album that will help country music reinvent itself, understand itself, and launch country music into arenas it never entered. It's arguably the greatest country album of all time. And I think with this new album that Beyonce will release just in a week or so, it promises to be that same kind of moment, that it looks back to country music's Black past, takes it into its present, and then launches it up to an excellence that it never met yet.
You're literally, from a Black historical standpoint, going from the Great Migration, when people were leaving, trying to get away from these Jim Crow laws, etc., migrating to Chicago and up north. And then, of course, we get the Ray Charles with the influences of the South. You're describing that whole thing in this beautiful story. One of my other favorite parts of the book that I read, you went to, what's his name? Scott Joplin's mother. You're finding these
yes.
stories.
Scott Joplin's mother. I'm so glad you spoke of that. Florence Joplin. If you can see behind me, I don't know if our people visit us on Facebook. That's a picture, that little girl right there on my fingertip. That's me. That's my mama. That's my daddy. That's my baby. That's when the Supremes were playing the Copacabana, 1964. And that weekend, my mother was getting jealous of the Supremes. Up until then, she thought she was pretty hot, and she was a pretty hot stuff in Detroit. I've had Dick Gregory and Harry Belafonte both at different times told me my mother was the most beautiful woman they ever knew who didn't use it professionally. But Mama was feeling very jealous of the Supremes at this weekend. So she didn't want to talk about Florence Ballard anymore. She did love Scott Joplin. And she reminded me, she had heard stories from Black showbiz gossip in Detroit. My father and mother at different times both lived in Black Bottom, the old Black extraordinary entertainment district of Detroit, Michigan. And so they knew that people tell that story that Scott Joplin's mama was a maid and worked in this cleaning of white people's houses. And in one of these houses, they found a piano, and that's how he started to have piano lessons. But no, Scott Joplin's mother was a professional musician before she was a maid. She only started being a maid when her husband, who she was a musician in a band with, left her, and she wasn't making enough money then as a musician. So she took up this. But before Scott Joplin had ever entered into this house where the mother was cleaning houses, he'd been born into a family where he actually was in a band with his brothers, with his siblings, and in a band with his mama and his daddy. And isn't that wild? Florence Joplin herself was an important musician that had been in multiple variations of a family band. And then we get this weird story now that Scott Joplin learns music when his mother is a maid. And one of the things that saddens me until very recent times, and so I'm glad that we're at a different moment. When we look at the great songwriters that we know of, now I'm going to say we know of, because one of the things I told you, I was born in Detroit in 1959. My father was from Selma, came up in the Great Migration. My father was a radical man. He loved Malcolm X. He was a deep thinker, only went to, I think, one semester of college because he couldn't stand being back down at Morris Brown in segregation after having had some freedom in Black Bottom in Detroit. But my father's one who looked at a hymnal and he said to me, "But you bet traditional was a colored gal." No, he believed that there were a lot of these songs that were just inherited, and they said traditional. that was just a colored woman, a Black woman probably wrote that.
Mm.
And I read later, Virginia Woolf said Anonymous was a woman, but I know my Black daddy was talking about that. He never read any Virginia Woolf. That we know a lot of what people say is, we don't know who wrote it. Black people wrote it. But when we talk about songwriting in America and people who get credit on the songs, how few Black women have been able to get in the highest pantheon of songwriting. It's a very small number that have been acknowledged. In all genres, I was looking at some Rolling Stone list of the greatest songwriters of all time. Now, that's just one lens, but so few women and so few Black women have they put on that list. But when we look all across, because there is so much gatekeeping. So when I look at my own career of Black women who have had more than one repeated, it's not, people can debate. I'm proud to have had a #1 country song that was 2 weeks at #1. I'm prouder that that song this year will be 30 years old this summer, and it's still streaming it has tens of millions of streams, and there was no streaming when that song came out 30 years ago. I'm proud of the fact that that song has become a recurrent country classic. And I'm proud that I had songs recorded in the 80s, the 90s, the aughts, the tens, because the system wasn't trying to let that happen. But what I like more now is that I look at Allison Russell, who wrote Persephone, which I consider to be one of the greatest country songs of all time. It's a new song. Rhiannon Giddens, Sunny War. I love all these new artists who are creating and singing songs and it doesn't matter to me whether they're getting on the charts or not. Some of them are, but they're creating whole bodies of recorded songs. The songs are getting recorded, they're getting into the world. And one of the ways that they're doing this is these new technologies, Instagram, TikTok. It doesn't allow for the same kind of gatekeeping that radio did. That radio can be viciously gatekeeping. And particularly now that it's not even different program directors and people all over the country, it can be corporately done at very centralized ways. It's harder to sneak in sideways. But you can sneak it, like you've got Instagram. I don't use TikTok, but I surely have found music, or young friends of mine had introduced me to music they met on TikTok. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And I think that this whole phenomena of what we see with Texas Hold'em was made possible in part because of this alternative media of Instagram that took this song to all the people. There are white people who think they hate Beyonce that couldn't resist it. I've seen them reporting it on TikTok that they wanted to hate the song, but they couldn't. There are Black people who think that they do not want to listen to any country, that are not only saying, are they listening to this Beyonce country song, that they are now finding the duo, they're finding other country that they want to hear. That it's new technologies make it possible for us to find new audiences and trouble the cultural redlining that goes on when we try to divide things by genre.
You are bringing up a major point that I always had a theory of, but you're confirming it. This through line between country music, which is basically the DNA of American culture, this through line from country music to pop music. For example, I grew up, my mother would play Willie Nelson, Reba McEntire, the Dixie Chicks, the Judds. She was obsessed with the Judds, and I love James Taylor and all these phenomenal people that you can hear the influences of today. And of course, Beyonce, growing up in Texas, she of course had access to this walking down the street every day. There's this appearance of a great divide in that way, but it's not really. It's just the undercurrent of American culture, the origins of pop music. And to me, that's what it is.
Absolutely. And I think that when people want to, like, many Americans, if I ask them what state has the largest number of Black people, I ask that question and people guess California, Florida, New York. Texas is the state with the largest number of Black people. And then they want to act like there are no Black cowboys. 20 to 30% of cowboys were actually Black. Cowboy culture is a brown and Black culture. I don't know, that's just factually true. And also Black people, although in the Great Migration, many of us left the rural South to go to the urban North, and many of our families did, but we have roots in the rural South, and there are plenty of Black people who live in the rural South today. And so it's this whitewashing of these Western spaces and of rural Southern spaces that bear no resemblance to reality, because
Absolutely.
actually we are in the rural South too. And what's come to a moment now is we are refusing to not be seen in these spaces. And we're refusing, I always said the part of Detroit I was raised in, which was almost 100% Black community. When I was a little girl, Detroit was a majority white city, but my Detroit was an all Black town. And it was really an all Black, in many ways, Southern town. I said I was born in Detroit, Alabama. Now, I have no illusions about what Detroit, Alabama, a lot better than Selma, Alabama. My father hated Alabama because none of our family down there could hardly vote. I remember when most of my cousins, adult cousins, voted for the first time. It was in my lifetime. My grandmother did not send my father and his brothers and sisters to school. My father did not go to school as a little boy. Because she said they beat the Black kids too much bad in the schools, and that my grandfather had the wherewithal to fight that part of the system. He kept his kids home. This was before, and it was no homeschooling, because at that point, my grandfather could not read or write. My grandmother could barely read or write. They learned to read and write by going to Black church. That's where they learned, to read and write, hearing the Bible. So my point is, but it was a rural experience. And this is part of why country resonates with me, because also the band, it is a treasure trove of so much hidden Black genius. And that's why I've insisted on Lil Hardin lived and died without anyone recognizing that she was one of the founders of country music.
Wow.
But the Black community knew, at least in my part of Detroit, and that's a truth now I want the world to know. Lil Hardin needs to be recognized for what she contributed. D. Ford Bailey needs to be recognized for what he contributed. Herb Jeffries needs to be recognized, even when you see Django Unchained, and I love that film. We need to recognize there is some debt to Herb Jeffries in that too.
Wow, there's so much I want to unpack. For example, the cowboy phrase, and how they were actually called, the cowboys were called herdsmen because Black people were called boys. So they called the cowboys boys until it became cool to be a cowboy. And that was one thing. But you talked about the influence of social media, and this, in academic terms, they would call it this opinion leadership, where you trust the opinion of someone. Now this is cool because the person you trust says it's cool. Or parasocial relationships, where you have this emotional one-sided connection with your artist of choice. And of course, Beyonce has the Beehive and everybody else who loves that. But you and I, and also this oral tradition, meaning what is the more power or social uh, excitement we give to the written documents versus the strong oral tradition that we have as Black people. For example, in your book, you were saying that they would be playing this music on the porch while walking down the street, and you can hear it playing, but nobody recorded it. So it doesn't exist. And you then, of course, start a section of your book and say, well, if that's the case, let's start from the recorded history. But before that, this rich history from the 1890s and before of phenomenal music, playing the banjo and making up instruments and their own
jug band music, all of these things, and the washboard. It is wild but you're an expert on fans and super fans. And one of the things I think is really interesting in this current moment and my own experience is, I feel like I'm Gutenberg generation. I came up with books and sounds and air, my grandmother singing to me in her lap. And so it's interesting to see beyond the Beehive, where are the Black super fans for our country? Where which of the new artists will arise in this current moment. And one of the things we haven't touched on is that line between blues and country. And I do want to talk about that for a moment. I love blues. I'm not an expert on blues. My own daughter, the poet Caroline Randall Williams, is an expert on blues. I love, Robert Johnson is such an important singer and poet. But blues almost argues in one way that we are on hell on earth. And it gives us a way to cope with being in hell on earth. And it's and the beauty. Country, that's where that evangelical or Black evangelical Christianity comes in. It has a little bit of, you may win today, but I'm gonna be in heaven on a cloud and you're gonna be down in some deep hell. It has an idea of heaven and is imagining, all the bad white people down in hell begging for a drop of water that they're not getting while you're eating milk and honey on the clouds bouncing. And I think, so it is always looking at saying the future will be better and it's going to be an ethical, just future. Like one of my favorite old country songs is also a gospel song. It's called Welcome Table. But it's about, I'm going to tell Jesus how you done me. I love that idea. Like that it's imagining I'm in heaven. And that song was captured in the civil rights movement. I'm going to tell Jesus, and it's talking about all the really racist politicians. But to me, that's part of that country thing, that the tomorrow will be better. And that there's going to be some kind of conversation. And sometimes the conversation can only be in music. That's going to make things better because I'm finally going to be seen in a conversation. I'm going to have, and that's why the lyrics are so important because it's like it's a verbal witness. I'm going to tell Jesus how you done me. And so I think that's part of what songs do and why songwriters are important is that we give witness, and sometimes we give witness to what's been invisible.
I love that. And we also have a shared thing, by the way. You said a little bit of it. DC. I was born in Maryland, but I was raised in Washington, DC. We both were in school in Georgetown. I went to Duke Ellington School of Performing Arts in Georgetown. And of course, you went to, what was it, Georgetown Day Academy, you said?
Yeah, at Georgetown Day School. We both have a DC, we have a DC part to us.
And with that being said, you had this part of the book, and it's at the beginning of your career. I loved it so much. You talking about you being this country girl, and of course, I believe I'm country because my family's from Brandywine, Maryland. But you said this country thing, and you were trying to get into school, and you just took a story about you and some strawberries and how you de-weeded the strawberries by putting plastic over it and having the strawberries. It's your ability to uh, describe in such visual words everything from your lyrical writing to your narrative form of writing in your books. It's incredible. How do you think that influence? Do you think that's a part of your influence is your writing ability, focusing on Black people and nature and honey and all these things? Just because you have
I
such
love that you bring up the strawberry situation because one of the things that happened, I was growing these strawberries and I weeded them by putting the trash bags on top of them and letting the plants pop out at the top. So I didn't have so much back-breaking labor. And the day I was going to harvest my strawberries, I woke up that morning and there were only like 3 or 4 strawberries left. The rabbits had eaten them. They had rabbit theft.
Mm.
And that was a big decision. That's like country music. I decided I was going to eat those strawberries because part of me thought I was supposed to have hundreds, thousands strawberries there. I had 4, but they were really sweet. And I said, I rode that rabbit theft of strawberries into Harvard because I wrote about that, about back-breaking labor. But as you read the book, what I didn't write about there was what else was being stolen of my innocence on that crazy farm. But like many people about nature, and have thought about being stolen from Africa, if you are stolen from Africa and you're in this new world, the only thing you might have left, you might not have your mama, your daddy, sometimes not even your own children, is the sky, the sun, and the stars. The only thing you might have left that you once had. is the color of purple in a different flower than the flower you knew back home in Africa.
Mm.
And so to me, but the same hand, when you've been worked like an element of the land, not as a sacred person on the land, like when you've been worked like cotton, when you've been worked like a plow, when you've been seeing people hung in the trees, it's easy to break with the land. And one of the things I love that I've done most in my own songwriting is I have a song called Who's Minding the Garden that was originally recorded by the great Glenn Campbell and has now recently been recorded on the new album by Reese Palmer. And it's about echo grief. And it's also about reckoning, about environmental reckoning. I have a song about a lynching. It was originally recorded by Mark O'Connor and John Cowan. Now the great Rhiannon Giddens has recorded that one. But it's about echo grief. It's about coming back to some kind of love of the land when the land has been so much of a part of your trauma and the setting of your trauma. And I love that art may be the only thing that can redeem the land, because it can bless the land that has been flooded with tears and blood and death. A song can rain down art, beauty, healing, inviolable beauty can occur and rain that down onto the land. And that may be the only thing that can transform that land back.
It's so interesting talking about slavery in the land. One of my favorite things, I'm doing some research on the music industry and well, Black people specifically. And one of my favorite things was before they changed the word race to be what it is today, meaning this visual representation of how we want to segment the population. Everybody was equal. They just had slaves, but it was not chattel slavery just yet. My favorite thing was the reason they chose African slaves was because they had mastered the land. They had mastered farming. They had mastered all of these skills. They were better craftsmen, which means slavery has this connotation of less than, when in actuality, the purpose of subjugation was because we were better than in these instances that was needed by the original colonies. And
they
that's
had the genius and the expertise in rice culture, and so honey, and all of this expertise in agricultural work. That is, and and there was religious aspects to it as well, because in the history of the world, and I really am a songwriter and novelist, but in a lot in the West, slavery, the notion of slavery was you were enslaving a human being. One of the things that's very different about American slavery, if you were in slavery in Rome, you were a Roman, you were enslaving a human being. Because of the religious nature of the colonies to some degree, the idea of enslaving a human being was an anathema to many of the people. So they had to say, these people are not people. And that was the most greatest viciousness, as well as the disruption of cultural groups that they oftentimes people were actively put together with people who did not share their language, did not share their common culture, their religion, their spiritual traditions. So that is this tremendous disruption of culture. But in spite of that, without help, Black people created new, vigorous, nurturing art in this new world.
Absolutely. I know we have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure we talk about your current project, but I want to add to that conversation the concept of the doctrine of discovery by Pope Alexander in the 1400s, which led to the subjugation of the rest of the world. Some people say it was one of the foundations of white supremacy, where they were able to discover new land for people who were not white and Christian, and based on this doctrine of our God-given right. Really interesting to end that conversation. But I want you to take some time to describe your new recording project that's coming out. We only have about 4 or 5 minutes left. So I want to make sure I want to give you enough time to really dive in. Who's a part of it? How did it come to be? All of those things.
Well, I am really thrilled about the new album. It drops on April 12th. It's on Old Boy Records. which was John Prine's label. The artists on it include Rhiannon Giddens, Reese Palmer, Allison Russell, Adia Victoria, Sunny War, Sister Strings, my own daughter, Caroline Randall Williams, Valerie June has an amazing piece on it. Sania is amazing on it. And Miko Marks. I think I love these women so much, I can do them. And the concept of the album is we're taking songs that were recorded, some of them actually, and some of them charted, but all by white artists. That I was writing songs about Black people from my own perspective, that often my heroes were Black women, Black men. But when they were recorded by white artists, people did not recognize that. And I felt that my heroes had often gotten or erased from my own narratives. And it's been so exciting that this group of extraordinary contemporary artists working in country and Americana and country adjacent have restored my legacy. Now I think that my songs may live into the 22nd century, because we're at 2024 right now. And this new album is very powerful because of what they bring to it. And it's powerful because of what I brought to it, because part of what I brought to it is my grandmother, who was born in the 19th century, and the songs and melodies she taught me when I was sitting on her lap. And so this album spans, it was born in the country songs my grandmother sang to me on her lap. And she heard them first in the 19th century, that I heard in the 20th century, that are now being refound in the 21st century. So I'm thrilled with that project. The book, My Black Country, is my memoir. It's a history of the Black people in country music and my first family of country that I just told you about. That's Lil Hardin, D. Fort Bailey, Ray Charles, Herb Jeffries, and Charlie Pride. But it's my 41 years in the industry. And in the intimate story, it's why songs have meant so much to me. I wrote my first country song as a very little girl. And I hope to write maybe my last one this year. I'm working on one. I'm threatening to go into songwriting retirement. But I have been writing for 65 years. And it took until now for me to see a Black woman at the top of the country charts. When I arrived here, Black men had been there. Charlie Pride had been there, would go there 30 times. But Black women have been culturally redlined out of the country charts. And I'm thrilled that I got to see a Black woman at the top of the charts before I retired from songwriting. But I'm thrilled to have my say in the memoir. And I hope it inspires other people, and particularly other Black women, to be defiant, to create and chart their own artistic path, that to realize that part of it is creating and charting your artistic vision, and part of it is strategizing in terms of business. Because you have to make your own weather. That's part of autonomy. You have to join organizations that are going to fight for you and with you, like SONA. And you've got to work, as I say, at both ends of the street. Aside from that, you're just hoping for some kind of good luck that never comes consistently.
I love that. Well, with my last few moments, I have to just agree with you that the majority of every shift in genre, every shift in culture traditionally comes from women. From the beginning of the music industry to today, we could talk about rap, for example, and how there would have never been any Rapper's Delight without a Black woman there to champion and produce that record, from Bessie Smith and all the writers, et cetera, et cetera.
And she's mentioned in my book. I loved hearing about, I love that.
Phenomenal. Well, I think is that exactly 1 o'clock. Thank you so much for the privilege of being able to have this conversation with you. And
well, Andrae, come down to Nashville. I want to write some country with you.
Look, I will be there in a few weeks. Don't play games. Let me know where to be, when to be there. And
We're doing it.
Phenomenal. All right. Thank you so much.